Thank you very much. We've talked a lot around education during the day, so this is the opportunity to focus on it in a little more detail. And we've got another distinguished panel for running that conversation. Peter Shergold, who's been the long-standing Chancellor of the University of Western Sydney, amongst many other things, is our first speaker. Pasi Sahlberg, who's a Professor of Education at the Southern Cross University in Lismore. Kim Beswick, who's the Director of the Gonski Institute for Education at the University of New South Wales, and Lisa Jackson-Pulver, PBC Indigenous at the University of Sydney, who's very kindly stepped in to this panel today. So I'll hand over to Peter.
Well, in July, I was delighted to attend a black tie gala dinner to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Royal Society of New South Wales. It was, I think, a glittering occasion. And in return, I've been given 10 minutes to change the world, or more modestly, to at least reshape Australian education. So I will seek to provoke you. So what's the problem? A lack of appropriately paid career paths for teachers, declining assessed educational standards in schools, at least relative to other countries, or a continuing lack of equity in educational outcomes? Well, yes, yes, and yes. And we've already heard today about other challenges: curriculum reform, teacher workload, and wonderfully from Bernie Shakeshaft, student disengagement. But I'm going to focus on just one major issue. It's a big one. It relates to how the concept of a knowledge nation has permeated our popular imagination in a manner which has distorted our perspective on educational success. The roots of the problem lie deeper than the way in which we teach at our schools or universities or TAFEs. We've come to forget what knowledge means or how it relates to contemporary society. Knowledge traditionally implied both theoretical and practical understanding of information and skills. It can be gained through formal education, of course, or by awareness or familiarity gained from life. And that's why people of my generation used to talk of the wisdom gained through the school of hard knocks. Unfortunately today, knowledge is generally perceived in terms of an academic prowess that prepares those who are most able scholastically with the capacity to forge professional or managerial careers. You know, whilst preparing the reports associated with my name and David Gonski's name, I talked to senior secondary students quite a bit. I found that in spite of evidence that there was continued high demand for apprentices and trainees, most students associated knowledge acquisition with those half of the students who aspired to go to university. And that unconscious bias is subverting educational purpose. Think about this. The ATAR is no more than a university ranking tool designed for administrative convenience. That's all it is. Yet too often it has become the dominant measure of school success, not just to teachers and their pupils, but even more profoundly to their parents. It privileges academic pathways. In the popular mind, the ATAR score is seen as more indicative of educational prowess than the high school leaving certificate. And in part, that's because the HSC can include more subjects that are vocationally oriented. The ATAR has come to define success in the mastery of knowledge. The educational development of the whole person has become narrowed down to a singled, aggregated number. How did you do at school? 94. That increasingly common perspective on knowledge is then echoed, as we've heard today, in our understanding of expertise. One of the good news stories to come out of COVID-19 in Australia was the elevation of expertise to the forefront of political life. Politicians sensibly recognised, especially when tough decisions to be made, that public health officials inspired greater public trust than they did. At least until the public became disheartened by the fact that epidemiologists disagreed amongst themselves and that public health officers appeared to moderate their advice in the interest of the governments they served. The bad news of COVID was that the concept of expertise that we carried into the pandemic was also hopelessly narrow. Only belatedly did governments come to recognise that frontline real-world expertise that sits in civil society. Non-government associations and organisations, especially those that delivered services to vulnerable communities, often had the knowledge of how best to communicate health advice, how best to persuade many communities to pro-social courses of action. Such expertise was routinely undervalued. The Governor of New South Wales, Margaret Beazley, was right. Communities were locked down during COVID. Equally important, community expertise was too often locked out. The innovation at the local level, identified by Stephen Garton, was generally discounted. The consequences of these simplistic assumptions about knowledge, about expertise, harm the decision-making of many young Australians. It undermines the social fabric of a fair go society. It fails to provide the diversity of skills and attributes that is necessary to lift productivity and sustain economic growth. So, how can narrow assumptions about educational success be widened? Well, at least 4 ways. First, we need to convey to students from an early age that the most important aspect of education is to allow them to pursue their interests, better still, their passions, in such a way that they can go on to live richer lives as adults, whether it's attending a Shakespeare play or stripping down a Harley-Davidson. I acknowledge that education also has an instrumentalist purpose, but here too, we tended to narrow horizons. I am fully persuaded that we need to prepare people for an uncertain future labour market in which forms of knowledge and expertise are likely to change rapidly. It's now more likely to be professional and administrative skills that are progressively eroded by cognitive technologies and digital communication and robotic automation, unlike 50 years ago, my generation, if you will, when it was predominantly trade and factory skills that were destroyed by automation. We need to emphasise in our teaching the virtues of adaptability to change. But there's an equally profound utilitarian goal of education, and we too often forget it. In a world in which the end of history now seems a distant memory of failed hopes, and in which liberal values of individual and collective freedom are under attack by authoritarianism, autocracy, and xenophobic nationalism, we need to instill in our students the significance of civic participation and active citizenship. The future of democratic governance depends upon it. So for both of those goals, as well as for personal fulfilment, we need our educational system to inculcate the desire to keep on learning. In preparing young Australians for adulthood, we need to ensure that they're flexible enough to continuously acquire new skills, to be able to change employment directions during their long working lives. And that means that our rhetoric, lifelong learning, needs to be accompanied by the public provision of lifelong career advice. The ever-present danger is that otherwise we'll have a growing body of workers whose relationship to the labour market is defined by casualisation and precariousness. Third, we need to forsake an increasingly simplistic, utterly bunkum demarcation between higher education on the one hand and vocational education on the other. It's an artificial distinction inculcated into school students at secondary school. The fact is that an increasing number of students now enter higher education institutions with vocational intent, a higher and higher proportion each year. And an increasing number of pathways now allow people to move relatively easily between forms of education when they leave school. Access to a growing array of micro-credentials is dissolving the rigidities of the Australian qualifications framework. Some people think this is worrying. I think it's a ripper. We need to stop suggesting to school students that they have to choose between demarcated dual sectors of higher or vocational education, between academic study or skills development, between university or TAFE. As a society, we need to reimagine a single tertiary education which fully integrates theoretical and practical perspectives. That, if you think about it, is the absolute history of the Royal Society. That is the thinking behind the decision to pilot colleges of a new Institute of Advanced Technology here in New South Wales. The goal is to provide students with the opportunities to progressively gain credential in the same course of studies, from Cert 4 through to a degree, by undertaking an industry-focused tertiary education that includes great chunks of workplace learning, but only, of course, for those students who are attracted to such a pathway. Finally, we need to go back to identifying explicitly the underlying attributes that young people need for their future employment, civil engagement, and their own purposeful lives. Without wishing to be overly prescriptive, that includes the ability to think through and solve problems, the ability to communicate clearly with civility, the ability to work collaboratively as part of a team, the ability to be creative in a myriad of different ways, the importance of being able to make decisions ethically. Young people need to be taught how to recognise these skills and behaviours, and given the sense of agency that they can learn how to assess the extent to which they are developing these attributes. Not just in the school classroom or sports field or workshop or auditorium, but learn how they're developing those skills in the volunteering that they undertake for the Red Cross, the advocacy they do for the World Wildlife Fund, the activism that they undertake, like Angelica, or the shifts that they work in Hungry Jacks. All of those are learning experiences. If we can instill that broader sense of learning, then we will have the opportunity to stop seeing educational inequities simply through the lens of social disadvantage. We've tended to do that too much today. By taking a strengths-based approach to learning, we can help young people to recognise the skills that they are acquiring in overcoming challenges. The Aboriginal boy in remote Australia who takes time out to learn men's business. The young migrant girl who has to interpret for her non-English speaking mum at the doctor's. The HSG student forced to learn online, working at the kitchen table during pandemic. These experiences of disadvantage can, with the help of teachers and mentors, start to be recognised as an opportunity to display the same underlying school-based skills that hopefully they acquire in studying English or fashion design, biology or business studies, maths or industrial technology. This then is the underlying purpose of these things called learning profiles that are being trialled right now in New South Wales and South Australia. They provide an opportunity to convey the important message that paths to learning are varied, that if one has learned to learn, there will be chances to enhance education and skills development together throughout life, and that vocational choice should reflect personal interest and ability, not just misplaced societal assumptions of status. That, I think, is the fundamental reshaping of education that Australia needs. It's certainly the one that young Australians deserve.
think that's going to be the first of a number of challenging presentations today. So thank you, Peter, and Pasi, for you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I guess I'm probably the only one who's using these traditional slides. I'm doing it because I'm mostly going to show you some data and graphics so that you can follow what I'm going to say. Thank you for the invitation to the Royal Society. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you. Basically, what I'm arguing here is that unless we have a clearer definition and agreement what equity in education means, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish that. And we still today don't have in a public policy documents or anywhere else an agreed clear definition for equity in education. Not only in this country, but it's a similar thing in many other places, and that's my basic argument here. Now, as you can probably hear from my accent, I'm not Australian. I'm an immigrant, fairly new newcomer here. I came almost exactly 4 years ago from Helsinki, Finland, here in Sydney, and now live in the Northern Rivers area. So everything I'm telling you within this next 10 minutes is, of course, something that I look at when I look at this situation here in education and educational equity through the lens of somebody who was born and raised and spent most of his life in Nordic countries. That is a very different universe when it comes to many of these issues. So the good news first, and it is that we have probably some of the best declarations and reviews and commission reports in the world, including this Alice Springs declaration. That I can tell you, I know a lot of similar declarations around the world. I still work with a number of governments, including advising the First Minister of Scotland and many others. And no other country has more beautiful, clear promise for children and their parents and the community and country than we have here through the Alice Springs Declaration. And all the declarations before that, the Melbourne, you name it. But where we still kind of struggle is to take these declarations and promises and commission reports and reviews seriously and then implement them. And that's a big difference between the Nordic people and Australians. You know, we are very good in making reports here and sign them and then shelf them. In the Nordic countries, we don't do much reports or reviews, but whenever we do, we put them in a practice. And that's something it is basically good news because we know many of these things. We know what the future education here should or could look like. That's not the problem. And, you know, people often ask me that now, after these years I spent in this beautiful country, I've been traveling in all the states and territories across this big land. I've seen hundreds of schools. People ask me that, so what's your view on Australian education? And I always say that I think we have the best education system in the world, but it's not for everyone. And that is also, it's a kind of a hard news to accept, but it's also good news because we do know what good schools look like. We do know what the good universities look like as well. So we need to figure out how we can kind of share this wisdom and experience we have here. We don't need to go shopping to the United States or England anymore. We know we are actually much more to sell nowadays about these things. And I apologize my colleagues in the panel that you don't probably see unless you lean over the table with this little screen what is there. But these slides are made available for you afterwards. So if you want to take a look. And now this is bad news. And often these days when you watch the TV news, if you do, you sometimes hear people saying there that the next episode includes images and sights that may be disturbing to some viewers. So if this makes you feel sick, just close your eyes and ears and you don't need to watch this. But I want to show you a little bit very quickly what this educational inequality or inequity here looks like. And it's not a pretty picture. And this is, I'm looking much more beyond the kind of what we are seeing right now. This is more about what we have seen already long ago and what this looks like in an international perspective. So this is the first one. And Australia has been part of the OECD's comparative study called PISA, Program for International Student Assessment, for the last 20 years. And I think what is significant here that shows you the 15-year-olds reading literacy development since year 2000 is that First of all, that we knew 20 years ago, if you go back to this graph in the very left-hand side, 20 years ago we saw that there's about 3 years of learning gap or schooling gap between the poorest, the most disadvantaged, socioeconomically disadvantaged students and the most affluent students when it comes to reading. And it's the same in mathematics and science. 20 years ago. So, and this is very important, that we have known this 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, that this is the situation, and nothing has happened. And a good question from anybody is that why we haven't done anything. And unless we change the way we think and do about these things, nothing's going to happen during the next 10 or 15 years. If it helps, we are not alone with this. There are many other countries have exactly the same type of trend. There are very few countries actually that have been able to close this learning gap between the poorest and the most affluent students. Okay, so we still have this 3 years gap at the age of 15. This is the other one, and both the OECD's PISA data and our NAPLAN data are not perfect, so there are many things that don't allow us to do what we actually should be doing, particularly with the NAPLAN data. So this is where I try to show you what happens when we follow one cohort of students, year 3 students, throughout the schooling until they are year 9. Okay, and this blue line that you see there, it represents the urban primary and high school students' performance in reading. I think it's a reading. Yeah, it's a reading achievement. Okay, are you with me? So this is the progress that students should make. The longer they spend in a school, they should make a progress like 1 year progress every year they go to school. Okay. What I'm going to show you here now is what happens in the remote and regional students, those exactly the same age kids that go to school outside of the urban schools, right? Okay, so this is a trend that is according to the NAPLAN data. So in the year 3, the rural children are already more than 1 year behind of their urban peers. And during these 6 years of schooling, it grows so that it's almost 2 years at the year 9. Okay, so this is one. This is not all about the equity, but this is one aspect of this growing and increasing gap that we have with students. This is something that we need to keep in mind and we need to address. This is probably the most kind of inconvenient image for anybody to look at. Again, this comes from the OECD's PISA data. So this is what you see here is the difference between our Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students 20 years ago in the first OECD's PISA study. So you see that there are 1/3 of the Indigenous kids when they're age of 15 were low-performing students in the PISA study. Low-performing in literacy means that your reading and writing skills are not at the level that would help you to cope and deal with the daily situations. Okay, and on the right-hand side there you see the other kids. It's still, we are 12% of all the other non-Indigenous students were low-performing students. Now, what do you think has happened during the last 20 years? Do we still have this 1/3 or less or more? We have actually a lot more. Okay, so this is what the image, the data shows that 43% of our Indigenous students in the latest OECD PISA study were low-performing students in literacy. So we're kind of approaching this 50% mark, where half of the Indigenous kids don't have the necessary literacy skills at the age of 15, again compared to the others. But the same trend is there with the other kids. And for me, for somebody who has spent here much less than you, this is something that it's not only hard to understand, but it's very difficult to accept that the situation that we have had this trend like this. So now let me offer you very quickly this idea of, if you criticize or question the definition of equity or understanding of equity, I think it's fair to say that, so what's your proposal? I'm going to offer you a very kind of a simple idea, not to say that this should be exactly the thing, how we should define or understand equity, but at least this is one step towards that. Now, for those who are not educators, this may be a kind of a difficult thing for you to get quickly, but whenever we are measuring students, like all these measurements in the NAPLAN and PISA and any other standardized measurement before, This is what the good tests, like NAPLAN or PISA, because they're technically very good, well-designed tests, this is what it should look like. The learning distribution should be in a kind of a normal distribution so that we have the means there in the middle, and then good students and the poorer students should be somehow separated from here. Now, the situation here in any place where there's an unequal or inequitable situation regarding education outcomes looks exactly like this. That most of the kids on the left-hand side are the most disadvantaged students, okay? And those kids who are doing well, who are there on the right-hand side of the mean, are mostly the less disadvantaged students, affluent kids. So this is here and in most other countries. Now, if we are serious about making education more equitable here, this is what we should be seeking. Of course, this would be an ideal situation that when we are measuring children here in NAPLAN or PISA or whatever measurement it is, that we should have all kinds of students there throughout this distribution. Okay? So this is like a first assumption or requirement for this definition of equity. Now, what you see here is the kind of an ideal situation. I call it close to equitable distribution of student test scores or learning outcomes of different students from different social or equity groups. Okay, so it's probably ideal. It's kind of a dream world. We should have a situation where all the students from these different equity groups should be performing exactly the same way. But that's why I call it a kind of a close to ideal. Now, what the situation is now is much more spread out. This performance. Now, what we do not have very much information here in Australia, unfortunately, for example, NAPLAN doesn't allow us to do that, is to see what is the gap between the more advanced, socioeconomically advanced and the poorest students. So that's something that we need to work on and make sure that we have better data through NAPLAN. So this is, again, what you see there would be a kind of a close to equitable situation where what this means is that it doesn't really matter what type of family you come from in terms of the socio-economic status or situation, your performance in school should still be similar. So here's my definition, kind of a proposal for you as I have argued. So this I try to keep this very simple and kind of a plain so that people can understand it. This has two different dimensions. The one is what we call a individual dimension, or adequate education. Basically, it means that all children should achieve a certain threshold level of education of their choice in a schooling. Normally here we say that everybody should have 12 years of schooling and then some type of tertiary education if necessary. But it's important, just like Peter was saying, that we need to have different options already in the high school for students rather than one-size-fits-all thing. Or we can talk about national minimum standards in assessments of mathematics and reading and science and some other things as well. So that's this adequate education is the one requirement. So it's the first requirement for this definition. And then the social equity, that goes back to the image that you saw before, means that the students' performance from when they come from different equity or social groups should be similar, and the distribution of their educational outcomes should be similar. Not the same, but similar. This is a hard requirement, and some people find it difficult to accept, but I don't think that we have any other choice, any other way to think about it. For example, when it comes to Indigenous students' performance, who would be ready to say that we would tolerate and accept a lower performance from Indigenous students or socioeconomically disadvantaged students than the rest? I think it's, for the nation like ours, we cannot just accept it. So that's why we need to keep this way. So people have been, I'm closing here, and people have been offering here interestingly, the three recommendations, a proposal. I'm going to do the same thing very quickly here. The first one, and there's not big news here because anybody who has been working in this equity space has heard this many times before. But if you ask me, and I think it's a fair question to say, what should we do? What would be the things that would help us to move forward? Of course, this investing in early years and early childhood education is something that is absolutely necessary thing. So currently we are spending about half of our national wealth into early years education compared to the OECD average. and about 1/3 about those what the Nordic countries, for example, is doing. So we have a much space there to invest more in the early years. And any economist, probably some people said it in the morning, that that's the best kind of a time to invest your money in people if you want to have a greatest return to your investments ever. The next one is the needs-based school funding, and this is something that has been debated and considered here for many, many years. And I think that this is something that if we keep in mind that most of the public schools in this state are underfunded, that they are not meeting the school resourcing standard. This is one of those promises that I think we should be keeping and making sure that all the public schools that are catering about 85% of the most disadvantaged students and about 85% of our Indigenous children should be fully funded so that they can do this equity work. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very difficult. And finally, this is something that we are now considering in this reimagining space when we are thinking about what Australian schools could look like in the future, that linking health and education, or well-being and learning more closely to one another. If you read the Productivity Commission's interim report that is proposing the content for the new National School Reform Agreement, interestingly there's an idea there that student well-being should be get in a kind of a same level of importance than education outcomes and considered as an outcome of schooling, which is, I think, interesting thing. If you want to take a closer look at what this could mean in detail here in Australia, I'm working with the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne in a project that is looking at this integration of health and education as in one place and one community called school in the future. For the sake of equity for everyone. Did this make any sense to you? You got my point? Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And now, thank you very much, Pasi. That was very, very helpful. Kim.
So I think what I've said is going to follow on quite nicely from what Pasi's just told you, although I won't be half as eloquent and I don't have the graphs. But I'm glad he's shown you some. As Pasi pointed out, some of the major problems in education require policy changes that have proven extraordinarily difficult. The funding of schools in particular springs to mind. We had the Gonski review back in 2011. And as Pasi pointed out, most government schools still don't meet their resourcing standard. And so there's not an equal playing field. So schools are not equally able to do the work that they need to do to support their students. What some of that leads to, and what is very characteristic of schools in Australia, and schools in other places as well, but certainly in Australia to a much greater extent than it should be, is a segregation between students according to SES, also according to geography, as Pasi pointed out, the difference between the performance of students in rural communities compared with their metropolitan counterparts and so on. And we're not going to solve any of these problems unless there is a groundswell of community activism or demand that these problems be addressed. And one of the problems with that is that often what is good for society and what most people acknowledge is good for society, that all schools should be terrific, there shouldn't be disparities in their resourcing and so forth, when you think about educating your own child and you think about which school will I send them to, that becomes a very different calculation. And I don't blame any parent, including myself, for making choices that might go against what you would advocate in a more abstract context. So that's a problem. So we do have to do some things, some work to find better ways to achieve the goals that segregation, deliberate structural segregation, is supposed to achieve, of educating each child appropriate to their ability and so on, in ways that don't exacerbate those inequalities. And that's the challenge, I think. So I'm going to talk mainly about mathematics education because my background is as a mathematics teacher and a math education researcher. But I hope, my belief is that the things I'm saying about mathematics apply to education more generally. And indeed, mathematics some of the things that have happened with mathematics teaching and mathematics performance have been forerunners of what we've seen in education more broadly. So mathematics has kind of led the way on teacher shortages and on declining performance. So we're not proud about that, but I think if we can, I guess, solve some of those issues and some of that commitment to segregation in mathematics, the rest of it might be relatively easier. So that's my hope. So, just when I came to New South Wales, it was only in the beginning of 2019, having spent the rest of my life in Tasmania, I was absolutely astonished by the depth of commitment to and acceptance of selective schooling and opportunity classes, those sorts of things in New South Wales. In fact, when I heard the term opportunity class, I had to Google that. What is that? And it dates back to 1932. So, and when I questioned out loud, you know, perhaps all students might deserve opportunities, I was met with horrified looks and you know, questions like, are you against aspiration? And I thought, what has that got to do with each other? So segregation as a way to meet the needs of high ability or high potential students is so well ingrained in the system and in the public imagination in New South Wales. It is to a certain extent in the rest of Australia as well, but to a much greater extent in New South Wales. And just to illustrate that, I think there are about 53 selective schools in New South Wales and maybe half a dozen in Western Australia and a couple in Victoria, and that's it. So it is very much a New South Welsh problem. So it helped me, though, to make sense of what I'd observed before in interactions with mathematics teachers from around Australia. Mathematics teachers are more convinced of the need to segregate students according to prior attainment than are teachers of any other subject. And teachers in New South Wales are more convinced than teachers in any other Australian jurisdiction of the need to stream students according to ability. So New South Wales maths teachers really think that streaming has to happen earlier and more stringently than do teachers of anything else anywhere else. So, and as Pasi pointed out, the performance of Australian students in mathematical literacy, according to the PISA program, has been in decline. And now in 2018, mathematics is the first domain that PISA assesses where Australia failed to be above the OECD average. So the mathematical performance of Australian 15-year-olds in 2018 was at the OECD average, not above. So that's a trend that the other domains may well follow. Let's hope not. There was also in 2018 the re-emergence of a gender gap in favour of boys as well, which is another trend that we're not pleased about. So we're not going to solve educational attainment issues and equity issues unless we can lift that long tail of low attainment without, of course, damaging the performance of our top end. I just want to say a little bit about NAPLAN in New South Wales, and the reason I'm saying this is to point out some things, some initiatives that clearly don't work. So in NAPLAN, students in New South Wales in numeracy perform better than those in Tasmania and the Northern Territory. And that is the end of that sentence. So they perform worse than those in WA and ACT and about the same as in the other states. And this is in spite of the fact that New South Wales has the most specified curriculum and syllabus documents, the most onerous processes for obtaining approval to teach, and the most demanding accreditation standards for initial teacher education programs and for teachers of all Australian states and territories. It also has the greatest commitment to student segregation, as I've said, based on supposed ability, both between and within schools and between and within school sectors. All of those things are aimed at achieving educational excellence. So clearly, they're not the answer. Okay. We know also that about 30% of the variation in students' achievement in New South Wales is associated with between-school factors, so things that vary between schools. That's higher than any other Australian jurisdiction, attributed to the higher number of selective schools in New South Wales. But nevertheless, there's about 70% of the variance that is within schools. So these are things that happen inside schools, which gives us hope, I guess, that schools might be able to address them. Putting aside the fact that schools are differently resourced to do that, but at least the potential is there. So I'm going to spend some time just talking about some of the structural within school things that go to inequality, particularly in mathematics. So students who are designated low attainers are typically grouped together, and in maths they're offered an impoverished curriculum that's based more firmly on widely held beliefs about the nature of mathematics as being very hierarchical and fixed than on any analysis of the conceptual difficulty of the ideas or the capabilities of the students. The lowest attaining students often struggle to recall basic facts. They may never know their tables, and these things, of course, are arguably not even mathematics. We've all got a machine in our calculator in our pockets that can do those things. So I would argue that insisting that these students continue to work on very basic material, typically covered in the first half of primary school, achieves little more than convincing these students that 1, they are stupid, 2, that mathematics is pointless, and too often that school is not for them. It does nothing to help them either to learn mathematics or to want to engage with the subject. Streaming students also impacts on staffing choices as well. The top classes who are studying or thought likely eventually to study the most demanding senior secondary subjects must have teachers who know the mathematics thoroughly, of course, and have experience of teaching it successfully. This means that the other, i.e. younger and low attaining groups, are typically taught by relatively inexperienced teachers who are less mathematically qualified and are often what we call out of field. So they don't have the qualifications to teach mathematics. They, of course, are doing their absolute best job that they can, so it's entirely not their fault, but they're put in that invidious position. There's research that shows also that teachers interact differently with lower attaining students. They have lower expectations, are less happy with those students' work and behaviour, and talk about the difficulties of teaching them. So students pick up on these negative messages that further lower their confidence that they can succeed, make them less likely to engage and expend effort, and hence the teacher's beliefs that they have low ability is reinforced. So you get this double downward spiral of the teacher and the student, and I think that's where some of the students in the Backtrack program might have started. So in summary, the students who have the greatest difficulty with mathematics and arguably have the greatest need for highly skilled teachers experience curricular and pedagogies focused on low level skills rather than on the development of meaningful understanding of the subject. And there are downsides, of course, for the high achievers as well. In any class, there's got to be somebody who's finding things a bit harder than most of their peers. So we end up with very capable students who come to see themselves as not very good at maths either, which is not a great thing. Students in high attaining classes also are less likely to be given problems that involve applications of mathematics. So they tend to focus on preparing for exams, for that magic ATAR that's going to define the rest of their lives. So we get those students also tending to hate the subject and not want to pursue it at university either. So it's really not a surprise that we've got declining numbers of students pursuing STEM subjects at the tertiary level. Okay, so it obviously operates along socio-economic lines as well. Teacher shortages are being felt everywhere now. I think we've all heard lots about that. But they've been felt for a long time in the most disadvantaged schools, remote schools, low SES, and so on. And the situation's been getting worse. But we knew it was bad in 2016 and even before then. In 2018, the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute estimated that there's a 76% chance that a student will have at least one out-of-field teacher in mathematics in their 7 to 10 years, a 35% chance that they'll have 2 out-of-field teachers, and an 8% chance that they'll have an out-of-field teacher in 3 of those years. Now, of course, they're averages. So if you happen to live in a rural or remote community, it's a much higher chance than that. And I know schools that are relatively close to regional university campuses where there is not a single qualified mathematics teacher. So it's a 100% chance for those students in every year. So it's a sad fact. There are other ways of addressing the needs of high ability students and meeting the needs of students where they are. We don't have to separate them into different groups according to ability. We certainly don't have to separate them into different schools. But as I said at the beginning, this is going to take some imagination. I think in New South Wales particularly, we suffer from being a large and relatively wealthy state. We're about a third of Australia's population. So we tend not to look to other jurisdictions. But there are other answers. No other state has gone down the selective schooling model to that extent. So we need to look beyond our state. We need to look internationally as well for other models that have worked and try those out. But we need to do it in a way where we gather evidence and we can bring along the public with us, that we can build their confidence so that parents know that if I send my child to the government school down the road instead of to a fee-paying independent school or a selective government school, that they are going to get a great education. Parents are not silly. They know about peer effects, as we call it in academia, so we're going to have to counter that as we go. Yes, so I think if we can manage that, we'll be a long way to achieving equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim. Now, Lisa.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a lovely afternoon. And this is the last panel session until the wrap-up. So my name is Lisa. My people come from Wagga Wagga in southwestern New South Wales. I'm a Koori woman. And I pay respects to the people of this land, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and recognise that the land that we're on has always been known, loved and nurtured. No matter where you're from, across Australia, there's not a place that's not called country and not called loved. So I was being asked at the last minute to not be Marcia. But I could be. I reckon the next session I'll have a go at channeling a bit of Marcia, because she's got a lot to say, and I do too. But I was asked to talk a little bit about the transformative power of education, our investment as a nation in education, and take stock of that investment and how it builds a better society. So I work at a large university. My background's in public health epidemiology, and everyone knows what that means nowadays. It's no longer having to explain it's not about the skin, people, although some of us do deal with that. But I now work as one of the Deputy Vice-Chancellors at the University of Sydney, and I look after the Indigenous Strategy and Services portfolio, although I do manage to get myself involved in significant other things across the university. So I wanted to talk specifically about one of the major levers that I've had the privilege and pleasure of being able to use in how it is we change the sector for good. For many, many years, decades and decades and decades, you talk about reports, oh my God, we have got reports that are miles high, that are tons worth of effort. We write reports and then we promptly do absolutely nothing about it. We've got tomes that act as really great bricks to hold doors open. And when we start looking in my own background in health, for example, in the 1970s, we had one of the best reports ever called the National Aboriginal Health Strategy. And if you pulled this out today and changed the date to 2022, there would be very little difference. And one of the things that I've learnt since I became a health professional in the 70s was that the best way of making change is to get engaged and involved in the accreditation bodies. And the body I'm going to talk a bit about today is a body called Universities Australia. I know many of you know them, but I'm hoping to give you a slightly different perspective as an Aboriginal academic in what happens with them in my world. So it's been a bit of an evolution about how Indigenous scholarship occurs in Australia. We've got more Aboriginal students than ever in tertiary education in the university sector, and certainly more Aboriginal scholars, academics, researchers and workers in the sector. And this has been evolving significantly since around about 2011, when there was a huge push towards this magic thing called indigenisation of curricula. Now, for many people, indigenisation of curricula was very much about putting on a selective piece of work that students could enrol in. And be careful, we're not going to evaluate it or do any sort of critique, but you need to enrol in this to complete your degree and off you go. And we found quick as sticks that didn't really make too much of a difference in people's practice of whatever it was that they were learning in their degree. So Universities Australia provided a helpful guide called Guiding Principles for Developing Indigenous Cultural Competency in Australian Universities, kind of thinking that might help people do the trick. There was recommended sector-wide commitments to the indigenisation of curriculum using sound pedagogical frameworks. Now that makes total sense, right? Like, why would you implement a curricula without anything sound that framed it up pedagogically? Just saying. Anyhow, they had this really marvellous quote, and I'll read it out to you. I'll try and do it justice. You know where this is going, don't you? I can see it. I know Peter does. So student and staff knowledges and understanding of Indigenous Australian cultures, histories and contemporary realities and awareness of Indigenous protocols, combined with a proficiency to engage and work effectively in Indigenous contexts, congruent to the expectations of Indigenous Australian people. Now, can someone please tell me what that really means? No, seriously, I'm really not trying to take the mickey, but it's really hard to understand what that means and what you can do practically to implement it. Now, I know it was a long time ago, right? It was 11 years ago, you know, it might as well. But, you know, at the time they were also saying, you know, one of the ways that you can do this is to embed Indigenous knowledges and perspectives in your curriculum. You can include Indigenous cultural competency and create formal graduate attributes or formal graduate qualities, which is helpful. You can incorporate Indigenous Australian knowledges and perspectives into programs. You can train teaching staff in Indigenous pedagogy for teaching Indigenous studies and help them feel confident in so doing. And of course, create reporting mechanisms, because we're really good at that in the Academy, aren't we? Writing reports and standardising and applying some sort of process of quality assurance and accountability across that curricula. Now, question. Who was therefore responsible for doing this? Do you want to have a guess? Oh, that's it. The chub goes to the lady over there. So yeah, absolutely, that fell on the already burdened workload, fairly junior staff, Aboriginal, right? To do something that in some of our universities we've got entire departments to do with highly qualified people that have spent half of their lives learning how to do that. So subsequent to that, Universities Australia looked at the outcomes of the sector and recognised we need to do a little bit more, and strategies are always evolving, especially when you're doing something new. And so they went off and created some new work, and basically, and again I quote, universities will differ in how they approach this. Okay, so that's good. So we've recognised that all of our universities are a bit different from each other, and that's a good thing. But more importantly, that the Aboriginal communities across the nation are a bit different from each other, and that in fact each of us have quite different circumstances. And we were looking earlier at some very helpful graphs on the differences between urban people and rural people and regional people and people who finished school at 14 versus those who finished school a little bit later, and where they went to school. So what they wanted to do is just to make sure that we were able to develop formal graduate attributes, discrete units of study, campus and off-campus experience and other activities, and the key thing that they underlined strongly was that this was to be done with local communities, with your local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So we were to look at our respective communities for advice on guidance on how to start operationalising the complexity of what Universities Australia wanted us to do. Now, this is not really a session on bagging them, but this is really a session about how sometimes goodwill can collide with the practical realities of what we need to do and how we need to do it. Realising that this particular load of advice was somewhat insufficient, Universities Australia very kindly released a good practice paper in 2019, and it's well worth a read, and I would advise you to do that. One of the stated intentions of the document was to function as a resource for universities to consider in their efforts when they go about indigenising curricula, and they added a very helpful reading list of academic papers, mostly done by Aboriginal scholars, along with a 9-point list, because we all love lists, right? So a 9-point roadmap, if you like. And that included that the university should have an Indigenous graduate attribute or similar, and that the course accreditation process should ensure that all courses are aligned to the achievement of this attribute. That makes total sense, right? Then they said that Indigenous curriculum should be coherently integrated into the degrees, so that it's not something that stands outside on its own as a special thing that people can skip if it's too early on a Friday morning. The appreciation or sensitivity to Indigenous knowledges, and that these knowledges or application of these knowledges should be assessed. Yeah, we all know that assessment drives learning, right? It's one of the most magical characteristics of my world. Teaching staff should also be sensitive to and appropriately prepared and experienced in Indigenous content that they teach. And this is really helpful because ultimately there are not that many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about at a sufficient level or who are qualified sufficiently to be able to teach. And we've just learned a beautiful example of maths teaching. We just don't have enough maths teachers to go around. Well, we certainly don't have enough Aboriginal people to implement this sort of really strong and important aspiration. The fifth thing they wanted was courses should include formal recognition of Indigenous knowledges, and that explicitly that knowledge is relevant and endorsed by the Indigenous bodies of the place where this is being taught. Now, this is also something which is quite useful, but when you've got content and you've got course materials that can go across, some of our universities are very big and we have multiple campuses. Sometimes what's taught here in the City of Sydney, for example, will not work in Wagga Wagga or Orange or Broken Hill or in another jurisdiction. So, you know, the guidance is helpful, but the application of that and the implementation of that can come awry very, very quickly when, again, high intentions just cannot be met. Courses should use language which reflects the diversity and multilingual practices of Indigenous Australians where possible, and I'm very pleased to report that many of our tertiary institutions are now gripping up language and starting to call courses by their right names in accordance with the local communities. Another is Indigenous graduate attributes or other course learning outcomes may be supported and enhanced by extracurricular or co-curricular activities, but they themselves are not a substitute for formal Indigenous curriculum development. So we just can't be let off the hook by having someone come in and talk about culture. The course accreditation process should demonstrate that Indigenous Australian stakeholders have been authentically consulted as a part of course development processes. Now, you all know about consultation mechanisms, don't you? Yeah, it's a pretty hard thing to do, and it's a pretty hard thing to do authentically. And it's very, very hard to do it in a way where you actually get all of the views that you really need to have at the same table. And then the final one of their 9 was Indigenous and non-Indigenous academic staff engagement in academic governance bodies and decision-making process are in the universities, and it's critical that this occurs at a senior level to enhance successful Indigenous curriculum development. Like I said before, this is a fantastic ideal, this is a fantastic expectation, but many of our universities and our sector as a whole has fallen absolutely short. And I'll share some data I've got with you, and I don't have a beautiful slide, although I'd love to. I should have done some slides actually, I really do like my slideshows, but it's okay. So 46% of universities reported that Indigenous viewpoints are considered and incorporated when designing education at their institutions. And when you tease that out, the majority of that content is designed primarily by non-Aboriginal people with advice from Indigenous people. 43% of universities reported having an Indigenous-specific graduate attribute. That's good. 33% of universities describe general Indigenous engagement as a process for embedding Indigenous views in course content. 31%, we're going down, 31% of universities reported having Indigenous content only in Indigenous courses, and only 15% of universities reported having processes for Indigenous content in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous courses. So the point here is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up just over 3% of the population. Might be generous and say less than 5% of the population. The majority of our universities do not have anywhere near that number of Aboriginal students and nowhere near that number of Aboriginal staff. So we are utterly and completely reliant upon the 95% of Australia's population to help us do this work. And I recognise that this might sound a little bit hard and harsh because, you know, we're a fantastic sector. You know, we're a sector that changes people's lives. You know, we're a sector that can, within a generation, make a massive difference. There were 3 additional points of good practice that Universities Australia did recommend at the time, and they said co-design and co-creation needs to be articulated in teaching and learning plans. An introduction of a template for indigenisation of curriculum and Indigenous content, pedagogies and methodologies are to be incorporated into all non-Indigenous specific courses. The current strategy has worked out and recognised that some of these aspirations are in fact not achievable at this point. And sometimes there is a bit of a scepticism, isn't there? When you're going for a particular aim, you're going for a particular strategy, and you know that chatter in your head is like, we're never going to get there. We're not going to get 3% of, our entire cohort of staff in the next 4 years. If we did that, then what happens to all the other organisations that are trying to get more staff? There is just this pragmatic, realistic reason why sometimes people will go ahead and put a stamp on something and say, yes, let's all go for it, but in their heads they're saying, it's not going to happen. And it's a terrible incongruence, and it's absolutely palpable. And I know that most of you, if someone was saying something to you and they were, really got a bit of a dialogue going in their heads, you would see that a mile away, right? Well, same with us. So Universities Australia has now asked us to have a close look at 6 commitments. So we keep going from 9 to 3 to 6. So here we are with 6. So we're sort of in the middle of the 9 to 3, or 3 to 9. We're also on time, that's even better. Okay, that's great. Hate being late. So, universities have Indigenous content in curricula that's meaningful, appropriately developed and appropriately resourced. So this is one of the first times they've really said that we need to have resourcing behind all of this, and that makes a major difference to how it is we can go ahead with our work. Universities ensure students graduate with an awareness of Indigenous values and knowledges. The benefits of Indigenous-led research is recognised and promoted by the universities, that there's a robust ethics process in Indigenous research with IATSIS guidelines and the other helpful guidelines to help us, that the value of Indigenous leadership is recognised by being appropriately structured and supported, and that the role of elders and local communities be appropriately recognised and valued. Now, these are really important, and this is central to the guidance that we're receiving from our sector leads. That universities have Indigenous content that is meaningful, appropriately developed and resourced, yet the strategy is fairly silent on many of those contexts, and of course it's up to us to make it happen. So the 3 things that I'm told that I was asked to leave with people, firstly, is to read what is expected of you, whether you're in the tertiary education sector, whether you're in the vocational sector or another. There are these documents that are absolutely everywhere. We're running out of time to be able to do something sensible in this area. We've pushed forward the needs to be equitable in our education system, in our housing system, and in all of our structures of governance for decades and decades and decades. It was only a couple of 100 years ago that Australia became the modern Australia became what it is today. But for 60,000 years, people have been learning and teaching on this land. And quite frankly, we have a lot to share. And one of the things that I would invite you to do is to work out how in your local ward you can make sure that that can happen for us all. Uni is transformative. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make the joint better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and especially under such short notice to be able to step up and deliver that assured presentation we very much appreciated. We're meant to be going into our plenary session at 4. I think that what we might have is about 5-10 minutes of questions now, and then we'll go straight into the discussion, if that's okay. So you won't get up a stand-up turnaround time this time. So first question here, and second question over here.
Thank you very much. Professor Debbie Husky-Leventhal from Macquarie University. And what a great panel it was to end a great day before we move on to talk about solutions. So we heard all day about systemic inequalities and issues and interconnected problems that require system thinking and a more systematic solution. So my question to the panel is, what role can higher education play and higher education institutions in addressing some of the issues that we've heard today, from mental well-being to housing affordability, beyond conducting more research and writing reports that apparently nobody ever reads or implements. How can we become a force for social change in a way that really utilizes everything that we know and we stand for as a force for good? And maybe as an option, how can we shift from the focus on employability of our students to a focus on impactability and their ability to create a positive social impact in the world?
Peter?
It's a really good question. When I was a public servant, I remember I'd just become a member of the Academy of the Social Sciences, and I gave a speech. This was 2002, and I bemoaned the fact that so much valuable research being undertaken in universities, research that did have that potential impact and public policy impact, was being lost in translation. There was a huge gulf between public servants on the one hand and academics on the other. And there was, to be frank, fault on both sides, and I've continued to believe that. So, on the whole, I think medical research does a much better job of having some influence. Science, a little bit. Social science, liberal arts and humanities, very little. You know, when you say, oh, give me a really good example of, you know, academia influencing public policy, I can't tell you the number of times it ends up with the introduction of HECS and income contingent fees in university that came out of Bruce Chapman at ANU. Yeah, and apart from that, what other examples? The truth is, it's a handful. So we've got to try and find a way, I think, that university academics feel comfortable and not losing their integrity in a way that can contribute to the making of public policy and other community impact. I'd have to say in New South Wales, I think I now chair something else called the James Martin Institute. And it's a really good idea because the New South Wales government put in $10 million, 3 universities, it will be more, but 3 at the moment, UTS, Sydney and Western Sydney, are matching that funding. And the whole purpose is to get public servants and academics working on real-world public policy issues together. I think we need that.
Well, my question is for Peter. Following on from that, it follows on nicely. My name's James Rennick. I'm a new Fellow of the Royal Society, and for 3.5 years I was the National Security Legislation Monitor within Prime Minister and Cabinet, and also do some teaching. And it struck me then that there can often be a dialogue of the deaf between the Academy and the public service. And in addition to that mutual comprehension about what the others do, there's also the fact that in the modern public service there is so much focus on service delivery, including policy delivery, including for ministers, that there's not enough time for deep thinking, which is what the best of the Academy can bring. So Peter, here's another idea for comment on, and it's this. The idea is secretaries, scholars. So you have 23 or so central federal public service departments, and the idea would be that each year the secretary or head of department, whatever they're called, take on for a year from a university, someone say at lecturer level, who works directly to them on policy matters, but also follows them round and learns by watching. And sure, they'll need a security clearance and all that sort of stuff. But it seems to me that's a relatively inexpensive thing to do. The idea is not that those people then immediately join the public service, but rather that they go back to their universities and display their newfound knowledge about the central public service. And it seems to me within a few short years you could have an incredibly powerful group of secretary-scholar cohort. Your thoughts?
I think it's a good idea. I wrote one of those many reports that seems to have disappeared in the e-waste bin. You remember I wrote a report called Learning from Failure, which was about the home insulation program. And I made similar suggestions in that. It was a report that was overwhelmingly well received with the kiss of death, namely accepted in principle, which means nothing actually happens. But I had a very similar idea there. I think it is a good idea, But can I come back to a number of things we've said today? I mean, the fact is that you do now have community organisations delivering a great deal of government policy and programs. The fact is they're treated as if they're just contracted to deliver. Why don't we get them and their frontline expertise involved in the words we keep talking about today, which is co-design? You know, we can all see government programs would be better, not just from academic input, but from the input of organisations that are actually going to deliver those programs.
Yeah. Lisa, I was struck just with your going through that policy document from Universities Australia. It seemed to me that in a way that what that was doing was we've talked a lot during the day about reports and how they've just gone into a waste paper bin or a shelf or whatever where they've just landed. And I thought that what you were reading from in that report from Universities Australia was an attempt to apply something, but in such a sort of a language and a sort of, actually, we're adopting the recommendation, but actually we don't want anything to happen. That the joined up bit of why this was being done was being lost in the translation as much as anything else. So I wonder about that. We've been talking, as I said, about reports not being implemented, but if they're implemented in a way that is just gobbledygook, it's almost worse in some ways.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue with that is that the reporting mechanisms usually go to the people that don't necessarily, in the institution, that don't necessarily have the umbrella view or the helicopter view across an organisation. And that can become very tricky. So certainly what I was wanting to share with you was that Universities Australia have gone through 3 significant iterations in the last decade or so, building on what they've learnt and the errors that they've made. And they've now come down to basically recognising that the onus has to be on the individual universities and they have to get behind their own people, their own communities, and resource it properly. And it's through that system that then the reporting mechanism goes back into Universities Australia. And that's really important so that we can start recognising the kinds of shifts that we're taking as a sector. Because up until recently, we've basically been acting like we're 39, 40 institutions all by ourselves, not recognising that we are a sovereign asset to this nation. Our sector has come out of the bones of this land, out of the need for Australia to have its own sector, and we still do not have that congruent pride of being an Australian university with an international reach. And that's across all of us. I'm sorry to say this to you, you can argue with me later, but I really haven't seen us working as a really strong sector together. And I think that if we can get something like the UA Indigenous strategy and interrogate it and turn that into a local implementation plan for each of our organisations and report back, there's going to be a lot to learn, and I think we'll get a lot of benefit out of it.
Thank you. There's a question I've got. Oh, you've got an urgent question, and the person here who was next, I think.
Julia Horn from the University of Sydney. I actually wanted to go back to the first panel session and Alison Frame's point about entrenched disadvantage, and also Richard Holden's point about education actually being key to creating human capital. And I guess this is, for the whole panel, but in particular Pasi and Kim, that I'm not sure if you've read the most recent productivity review, which is on education. Okay, good. You're nodding your head, where it actually focuses not only on higher education, but also primary and secondary education and the link to tertiary education. In there, it has very disturbing figures about funding and where that funding is going. So it points out that the majority of funding goes to the Catholic school sector, and even more goes to the independent sector, with a national average being 20%. And, the Catholic and independent is about 36 and 40%, I think. Yet government schools are only 18%, and it doesn't then break down, the sort of inequities, Kim, which you were talking about between segregated schools. But anyway, just to sort of wind that up, that their point is that all this extra funding's gone in, it's been distributed inequitably, and it actually hasn't produced better results in terms of however you measure educational outcomes. So people actually getting, trained into being productive citizens. So I just wonder, can we expand that notion of entrenched disadvantage? And is there a way where, in fact, we should be concentrating on, sort of, in essence, putting money into that part? It might be only a small part of the population, but if you get that right, is there then, the beginning of actually addressing that question of equity in education? Because it seems to have been a long time sort of being successful.
Thanks, Julia. Can I just add something to Julia's question, which is just a little bit more data, which is that we have 54% of kids now in high schools in fee-paying schools, a rising percentage of primary school children in fee-paying schools. So the segregation is not just brainy kids and the rest. I mean, in New South Wales, it's single-sex schools, it's religious schools, it's by socioeconomic, there's a whole range of different forms of segregation in the education system which add into the picture that was there. And I'm just interested, given that you're both interested and so expert in the sort of question of equity, is can that be fixed without the system being fundamentally reshaped? It's not a leading question. They might say yes.
The short answer is no, it can't without a major shift in the system. And I think Australia really does need to seriously look at the funding of education, and we know how to do that as well. There've been other reports. We've had reports, but it's not just the political will. It's as I was trying to say. It's the community demand for it, because the current situation is partly so well entrenched because the graduates, the alumni of those very most well-off and advantaged schools end up in very powerful positions with very vested interests and, much interest in maintaining the status quo. And so it's going to take a major shake-up to change that. I don't think we can wait for that to happen, though. So, I mean, and even when, I'm going to say when, to be optimistic, we fix that funding and we get a level playing field in terms of funding, there are still barriers to choice about schools that you go to because of geography. So we need to fix those things as well. And that's, some of that goes to changing the way that all of us, teachers included, because teachers are simply part of the community, think about the capacities of students, and move away from a deficit view of, because you're Indigenous, because you're in a rural school, because of whatever, that you're not as capable as a child from a wealthy suburb in Sydney. And we know, I've done research that shows that teachers do teach differently and have different expectations of kids depending on their family background. So we must shift that. And some of the in-school segregation just reinforces that kind of thing. And it's not really the teacher's fault, because if you are sent to one of those disadvantaged rural schools and that's the only place you've ever taught, you don't actually know what a really well-resourced, well-backed 15-year-old can do. You never get to see it. And the kids in the class never get to see that either. So, we've got to attack this problem at every level, I think.
Pasi, and then...
Yeah, very quickly. Oh, sorry. Just very quickly, I don't want us to get too down here. I am agreed. To make systemic change takes a lot, especially the sort of change I'm talking about. But yes, you can do things instantly. Angelica said something that just went by, and I don't know if she's still here. She said something from the 2021 census. Did you hear it? That people in Western Sydney now have higher levels of proportion of people with degrees than the rest of Sydney. Just think about that. If I tell you even 10 years ago, that would be, you wouldn't believe. So some things can be possible, but it's no use waiting for government. This has happened in part because you've had waves of migrants coming through, their children coming into the Catholic schools, the public schools, the independent schools, most of low-income Christian and Islamic schools, okay, coming in with big ambitions for their children, and those ambitions have then raised the ambitions of all the children in there. You've had a university that has run a very significant program, starting at year 9, now starting at primary schools, with over 92 schools in that area. That too raises expectations. You provide large numbers of scholarships and grants and support for people to come into university, so that Western Sydney University, this is extraordinary, now has 907 students who came to this country on humanitarian visas or are still here on bridging visas. So you can do it, but sometimes you've got to do it at the university and the community level, not wait for the big reforms to come out of government.
Yeah, can I just, I don't actually have too much to add, other than people probably need to know this, that there's no other country in the world that funds schools like we do, that the money is coming from all over the place, and everybody pays. You know, if you ask me after 4 years here, I can tell you that we don't have public schools, we don't have private schools either, because everybody pays. On average, parents whose children go to public schools pay about $800 a year for public school. That could be it would be the major violation in most other countries against the constitution or wherever the right to education is stipulated. But here it's a kind of a normal thing. If your kids go to the Sydney Boys School, it's more than $3,000, maybe $4,000, which is a kind of a private school fee. So we need to kind of think not only kind of a redesign, rethink this whole thing, but ask these hard questions. That is this the way to go? And I think basically we should be able to redesign the whole thing so that at least all the public schools, government schools, should be funded up to the school resourcing standard, which is a kind of a minimum thing. But I also want to say that funding alone will not fix these inequalities. That's a kind of a misbelief if you say that just give us enough money and we'll fix these things. It doesn't happen. So we need to go beyond that. But that's a kind of a minimum starting point.
Now, thank you. I've now got 2 questions and it's 4:20. So I'm just sort of thinking, if I take the extra 2 questions, are you prepared to hang on for an extra 15 minutes after 5 for talking, or am I going to cut off the 2 questions? Your call. This is a community participation event. Move on. Okay. So sorry, sir, your question's being cancelled. You've just been cancelled by the mob. But come and ask them the questions later. Yeah, that's right. So I'm sorry about that. Can I ask you to join me in thanking the panel?